Subcommittee on Energy and Environment will come to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Fostering Quality Science at EPA, the Need for Common Sense Reform. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witness panel. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. First of all, I want to thank you for your patience as we went through our first series of votes. And I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's hearing on fostering quality science at EPA. I'd like to note my appreciation at the outset to Dr. Anastas for moving your schedule around in order to be with us today. I was a little disappointed that we didn't get your testimony until late last night, so I haven't had the chance to review it, but I look forward to hearing it in person. I trust that you'll make sure to try to meet the committee deadlines, a little more leeway time there in the future. In the last 9 months, this committee has held 7 different hearings on issues related to EPA science and process. In each of these hearings, we have questioned the processes by which the agency ensures the development and dissemination of quality science and raised concerns about EPA moving forward on specific regulations before the science is available to inform those decisions. In today's hearing, we are discussing the overall science enterprise and its function within EPA. Research and development in EPA have been authorized by a number of environmental laws, but the Environmental Research Development and Demonstration Authorization Act, or ERDA, is the only statute dedicated solely to science activities in the agency. This law, first enacted in 1976, was reauthorized annually through fiscal year 1981, providing authorization levels to address different environmental issues. Additionally, ERDA established the Office of Research and Development, required 5-year R&D plans, and created EPA's Science Advisory Board. However, despite numerous efforts in both the House and Senate, no reauthorization has occurred in 30 years. EPA is a unique agency in that it performs the functions of the scientist, the policymaker, the regulator, and the enforcer. Since it has been 40 years since the creation of the agency and 30 years since science activities were last authorized, it's both appropriate and necessary for Congress to evaluate the effectiveness of the EPA in fulfilling all of those roles. In the current economic climate and given the EPA's breadth of jurisdiction over the economy, the agency must be vigilant in ensuring that it only promulgates regulations that are necessary and appropriate to protect public health and welfare. Quality science is an essential requirement in creating these regulations. Yet time and again, EPA's scientific justification for many of its rules and regulations have been questioned based on concerns with data quality, peer review, lack of transparency, and other process problems. It has gotten to the point where the perception is that EPA may have a penchant for pursuing outcome-based science in order to validate its regulatory agenda. This has led to a crisis of confidence that undermines the ability of the public to trust what EPA says, an untenable situation for an agency with sweeping authority over the nation's economic activity. So what can be done to fix this dilemma? Is it a question of greater oversight, or are there fundamental changes within the organization of EPA that are needed to address these problems? There have been reports, evaluations, and studies over the years that have identified the specific problems within the EPA science enterprise. Consequently, these reports have contained recommendations to the agency on how to alleviate these problems. Unfortunately, many of these recommendations have not been followed, and all too often Congress has been absent from these reform efforts. As this committee undertakes the process to reauthorize ERDA, I invite any interested stakeholders to provide recommendations and suggestions. Similarly, I welcome the suggestions of my colleagues across the aisle and hope that they'll view this as an opportunity to collaborate on much-needed reforms. Science activities at EPA comprise only a fraction of the agency's overall budget, but their importance and impact on jobs in the economy are enormous. Good regulations must be based on good science, and good science requires transparency, quality data, and confirmation of processes and results through peer review. In other words, it requires an adherence to the scientific method and long-standing principles governing the incorporation and use of scientific and technical information to regulatory decision-making. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Again, I apologize for the delay, and I look forward to a constructive discussion. I yield back my time. I now want to recognize Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ranking Member Miller wanted to be here at the start of this hearing but had a scheduling conflict and will join us later. I want to thank Chair Harris for holding a hearing to examine the ability of EPA's research enterprise to meet the agency's mission to protect public health and the environment. Scientific research, knowledge, and technical information are fundamental to EPA's mission and inform its standard-setting, regulatory compliance, and enforcement functions. The agency's scientific performance is particularly important as complex environmental issues emerge and evolve. And it is science, not partisan politics, which should guide their resolution. Unfortunately, controversy continues to surround many of the agency's areas of responsibility. Let me be clear, there may be some legitimate concerns related to EPA's research enterprise, but EPA is not the demonic agency that our Republican majority has made it out to be this Congress. This hearing is the beginning of a real opportunity to become informed about structural and substantive concerns related to EPA's research activities. I hope that my Republican counterparts are really interested in reform that will lead to better research to enhance public health and protect our environment. I do not believe anyone would disagree that we should always adhere to best practices, transparency, and indeed integrity in all of our work. That is why in 2008, the ranking member of this subcommittee, Mr. Miller, requested that the GAO to take a look at the independent evaluations that have been done over the past 20 years and that identified problems with the EPA's 35 laboratories operations and management. In an atmosphere of constrained budgets, it is imperative that with EPA's increasing need to understand complex environmental problems, they are positioned to formulate sound environmental protection policies. These independent evaluations have called for improved planning, coordination, and leadership, as well as consolidation of laboratories. The EPA operates some 35 laboratories to provide the scientific foundation for its mission. When it was established in 1970, EPA inherited 42 laboratories from programs in various federal departments. EPA has since closed or consolidated some laboratories and created new ones to support its core mission. Of course, closing facilities always has an impact on the surrounding community. That impact could perhaps be amplified given the current state of the economy, and we must be mindful of such outcomes. Despite this, it is still our responsibility to explore all options for productive and effective cost savings. Independent evaluations and the GAO have highlighted the need for the EPA to develop a coordinated planning process for its scientific activities and improve agency-wide research planning, among many other suggestions. It is important to note that these issues are not new under the current administration. They span the activities and inactivity of several administrations. Don't be fooled by the rhetoric on the right that the Obama administration was the impetus of the concerns expressed here. These concerns did not appear overnight or in just the past 3 years. They will need to be corrected over time, and any reorganization will need to be done in an orderly, well-thought-out manner with much oversight and input. In recent years, the IG has put forward many recommendations to improve the ORD that appear to have been embraced by the agency. Overall, the IG has found that the EPA ORD peer review process adequately produces objective scientific reviews. As we have said time and time again in this committee, good policy and decisions begin with good science. I am sure there is room for improvement, and I hope we can work together to identify opportunities to make EPA more effective in protecting the public and our environment. Today, we are presented with the perfect opportunity to show American taxpayers that not every issue needs to be polarizing or politicized. It's an opportunity for Congress to be productive and objective. It's also an opportunity to put our differences aside and have meaningful conversations and exchanges of ideas. We need to build upon EPA's scientific legacy and ensure that we continue to improve our shared environment, including for future generations. Chairman Harris, we look forward to working with you in the months ahead. With that, I conclude my opening remarks, but would ask, Mr. Chair, that before I yield back, I do have one further point of business, if you'll allow me to continue.
Without objection.
Mr. Chair, I want to ensure that we include into the record the written testimony of Dr. Granger Morgan, the former chair of the EPA Science Advisory Board. He included with his testimony a letter expressing his frustration with the surrounding events of our committee's request for him to testify. And he states, and I'd read the first two paragraphs of his letter, that are addressed to you, Andy Harris, MD, as chair, and Representative Brad Miller of North Carolina as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment. Dear Congressman Harris and Miller, several days ago I was contacted by committee staff about the possibility of testifying to the hearing you are holding tomorrow afternoon on the EPA Science Advisory Board. Because I had academic conflicts, I was not able to attend the hearing. Last evening, your staff indicated that arrangements could be made for me to testify over a video link if I could get my testimony prepared and submitted by midday today. Accordingly, I dropped everything and prepared the testimony that follows. I have just now been informed that my testimony is no longer desired. I understand that such things happen. However, having already spent the time to write my remarks, I thought you and some other members might find it of some use to see what I had prepared. Chairman Harris, these are difficult words to read. Here in Congress, we call on some of the world's best experts to come and testify. These are busy people who sacrifice their time and their resources as a service to our country. I hope this type of situation does not occur again, and that under your leadership we can improve the committee's relationship with potential witnesses going forward. Mr. Chair, I ask for unanimous consent to enter this testimony into the record.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask for a clarification. Would you want to submit the letter into the record? Is that right? So not as testimony.
Included altogether.
It's included all together, I'm told.
Yes, that's the testimony.
His testimony and his letter.
Well, I mean, my concern is that, you know, with testimony, we would get to actually question people who actually submit testimony. So it's just a minor clarification. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to submit his letter,
Okay.
a letter with an attachment into the record, but I don't think we can really call it testimony.
Yeah, we would have to just cut it out because that's how he.
Yeah,
Sure.
we'll
Okay,
provide,
amended.
we'll abide by that and provide
Okay.
what we have here on behalf of the witness who had hoped he could present, Mr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tonko, and we will absolutely. I mean, we recognize that the people we ask to appear in front of this committee are very busy, and it's sometimes difficult to arrange a schedule. And you know, even with the delay to them, I mean, sometimes we have to juggle even within that schedule. But yes, it is my desire to do that, to make it easy for someone to come and share their experience with the American public in a congressional hearing.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witness panel. Our first witness today is Dr. Paul Anastas, well known to the committee and subcommittee, the Assistant Administrator of the Office of Research and Development at EPA. The next witness will be Mr. David Trimble, Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. General Accounting Office, and I guess the way you're sitting here, the other witness is Mr. Arthur Elkins, Inspector General of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you all for appearing for the subcommittee today. Now, we were notified that we may actually, in another half hour or so, go back for one more vote or possibly two more votes. So we're going to go through the testimony. We're going to start questioning. We'll see where that ends up. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize our first witness, Dr. Paul Anastas, Assistant Administrator of the Office of Research and Development at the EPA. Dr. Anastas.
Good afternoon, Chairman Harris, Congressman Tonko, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm Paul Anastas. I am the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Research and Development at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about EPA's research programs. Scientific research is vital to pursuing EPA's mission of protecting human health and the environment. As EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson has said time and again, science is the backbone of EPA. All of the agency's decisions and actions are grounded in sound and rigorous science. That is what the American people expect and deserve. Every day, the scientists and engineers in EPA's Office of Research and Development demonstrate excellence and dedication in their scientific work. I could not be more proud of my colleagues or more confident in their abilities. But we all recognize that in science there is no room for arrogance. That is why we work closely with our Science Advisory Board to obtain independent, external peer review of our research plans, and with our Board of Scientific Counselors to obtain peer review of our research products. At every step along the way, we seek input from the scientific community and the public. We welcome their comments and we address them. This process, which can include public comment periods, open peer review sessions, and public meetings, is one of the most rigorous and transparent peer review processes anywhere. We firmly believe that when it comes to science, transparency is the most powerful way to ensure integrity. The agency depends on its Office of Research and Development to provide the scientific tools, assessments, and technologies to inform decision-making. For this reason, in addition to being sound and transparent, EPA's research must also be highly effective and responsive. Over the past year, EPA has engaged in a major effort to strengthen its research program with two primary goals. First, to ensure that our research most effectively meets the needs of those who use and depend upon it, including EPA's program and regional offices. Second, to ensure the cohesiveness of research across the Office of Research and Development, including the development of collaborative research plans that cut across multiple disciplines and multiple laboratories. With these goals in mind, EPA research programs were aligned into four cross-cutting areas. 1, air, climate, and energy. 2, safe and sustainable water resources. 3, sustainable and healthy communities. And 4, chemical safety for sustainability. In addition, EPA is continuing to fulfill its scientific responsibilities in two targeted research areas, Homeland Security and Human Health Assessment. Realigning our research has made EPA's scientific enterprise more effective by design. We have new opportunities to coordinate scientific expertise, capabilities, and resources that were previously managed separately. We have built engagement with EPA's program and regional offices into every stage of the research process to ensure that their needs are met in a timely and responsive manner. We have broken down the traditional boundaries between scientific disciplines so that our scientists can more effectively address cross-cutting real-world challenges. In their 2011 joint report, EPA Science Advisory Board and Board of Scientific Counselors stated that they, quote, strongly support ORD's consolidation and realignment of research programs, end quote. Science and technology in EPA is not limited to the agency's Office of Research and Development. A network of laboratories spans across ORD, program offices, and regional laboratory organizations, each with different objectives toward the pursuit of EPA's mission. To be clear, the Office of Research and Development laboratories conduct research and assessments that inform many of the agency's actions and decisions, including protective standards and guidance. The program office laboratories develop science that supports regulatory implementation, compliance, and enforcement at the national level. Regional laboratories provide technical information to support immediate regional needs and regional decision-making. The recent GAO report on EPA's laboratory network recommends that the EPA administrator take several actions to improve the cohesion and management of the agency's laboratories. We take these recommendations very seriously, and I invite you to review the EPA's response to each of these recommendations in my written testimony. To conclude, EPA has a strong tradition of scientific excellence. In all of our research, we are committed to strong science, continual improvement, and scientific openness on behalf of the American people. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today, and I'll be happy to take questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anastas. I now recognize our second witness, Mr. Arthur Elkins, Inspector General of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Elkins.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Harris, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the Subcommittee. I am Arthur Elkins, Jr., Inspector General at the EPA. I am pleased to appear before you today to discuss recent work conducted by my office related to EPA's Office of Research and Development. My submitted statement for the record details this work. Today, I want to focus on three areas: peer review panels, scientific integrity, and EPA's overall workforce and workload, which have implications for ORD. Peer review is an important process for enhancing scientific work products so that the decisions made by EPA have a sound, credible basis. In 2009, we reviewed EPA's peer review process in response to concerns about EPA's handling of allegations of a lack of impartiality on one of its peer review panels. Our review focused on EPA's National Center for Environmental Assessment, one of ORD's primary users of peer reviews. We found that the laws, regulations, and requirements governing EPA's peer review process are adequate to produce objective scientific reviews, but that EPA needed to improve its operating guidance. Basically, impartiality was vaguely defined, and procedures addressing conflict of interest needed to be improved, as did documentation of resolutions. We made recommendations to ORD to improve its peer review process in each of these areas. ORD agreed to all of our recommendations and certified that these corrective actions were completed in December 2009. This year, we looked at whether ORD has controls to address scientific integrity and research misconduct, and how effective those controls are. We found that ORD has internal controls that includes policies, procedures, training, and peer review. However, ORD could improve how it evaluates the effectiveness of its policies and procedures for scientific integrity. ORD did not test its policies and procedures because ORD asserted that few reported instances of misconduct means that it generally does not occur. However, few identified instances could signal that staff lack awareness of criteria and reporting requirements necessary to identify and report misconduct. As part of our work, we surveyed ORD's science staff on an awareness of EPA's scientific integrity policies. We found that nearly two-thirds of respondents were unaware of EPA's policies and procedures on research misconduct, and nearly one-third of respondents were unaware of EPA's scientific integrity principles. We made recommendations to ORD to strengthen their controls and raise awareness about scientific integrity and research misconduct. ORD agreed with our recommendations and plans to complete all corrective actions by September 2012. For an organization to operate efficiently and effectively, it must know what its workload is so that it can accurately determine the resource levels needed to carry out its work. We have issued 3 reports since 2010 examining how EPA manages its workload and workforce levels overall, which I believe have implications for ORD. We found that EPA has not collected comprehensive workload data or conducted workload analysis across the agency in about 20 years. The agency does not require program offices to collect and maintain workload data. Without sufficient workload data, program offices are limited in their ability to analyze their workloads and accurately estimate resource needs. Therefore, the agency must base budget decisions primarily on subjective justifications at a time when budgets continue to tighten and data-driven decisions are critical. We also found that the agency's policies and procedures do not include a process for determining resource levels based on workload as prescribed by OMB. As a result, the agency cannot demonstrate that it has the right number of resources to accomplish its mission. Finally, we found that the agency does not have a coherent program of position management to assure the efficient and effective use of its workforce. We made several recommendations to address these findings. EPA has not committed to a specific course of action with milestones for completion of many of our recommendations. Therefore, they remain open pending our receipt of an acceptable corrective action plan. In conclusion, OIG work has identified areas where ORD can improve its operations and activities so it can better provide the solid underpinning of science necessary for EPA regulatory decision-making. I believe the OIG has made a positive impact through the many recommendations we have made to ORD in those areas. To their credit, ORD has been receptive to many of our recommendations. We will continue to work with ORD to identify additional areas needing attention. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I would be pleased to answer any questions this subcommittee may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elkins. Our third and final witness, Mr. David Trimble, Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. General Accounting Office. Mr. Trimble.
Chairman Harris, Congressman Tonko, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's work on EPA's laboratories. As you know, EPA operates its own laboratories because scientific research, knowledge, and technical information are fundamental to its mission and underpin the policies and regulations the agency implements. My testimony draws on the report we issued in July of this year on EPA's laboratory operations and will focus on 3 areas: long-standing planning, coordination, and leadership issues, management of EPA's workload and workforce, and management of EPA's real property. First, EPA has not fully implemented key recommendations from prior independent evaluations that were aimed at improving long-standing planning, coordination, and leadership issues. A 1992 expert panel recommended that EPA implement a planning process that integrates and coordinates scientific work throughout the agency, including the work of its regional, program, and office and research and development laboratories. EPA has not fully implemented this recommendation. Instead, these offices independently plan the activities of their respective laboratories based on their own office's priorities and needs. Consequently, EPA has a limited ability to know if scientific activities are being unintentionally duplicated among the laboratories or if opportunities exist to collaborate and share scientific expertise, equipment, and facilities across organizational boundaries. A 1994 evaluation by MITRE recommended EPA consolidate and realign its laboratory facilities and workforce, finding that the geographic separation of laboratories hampered their efficiency and technical operations, and that consolidation and realignment could improve planning and coordination, problems MITRE noted had hampered EPA's science and technical community for years. EPA has not fully implemented this recommendation and currently operates 37 labs across the nation. 3 studies, including 2 by the National Research Council, noted that EPA's planning and coordination issues are due, in part, to the lack of a top science official with the responsibility or authority to coordinate, oversee, and make management decisions regarding major scientific activities throughout the agency. In a 2000 report on improving science at EPA, NRC noted that the lack of a top science official was a formula for weak scientific performance in the agency and poor scientific credibility outside the agency. Currently, EPA operates its laboratories under the direction of 15 different senior officials using 15 different organizational and management structures. In response to our report, EPA has proposed to increase the responsibilities of its science advisor. It is not clear that this will fully address the issue. On this point, let me note that the NRC's 2000 report concluded that the designation of ORD as the coordinator for the agency's scientific planning activities had proved to be insufficient because the position did not provide the level of authority or responsibility for oversight, coordination, and decision-making. It also noted that the assistant administrator for ORD could not be reasonably expected to direct world-class science at ORD and also try to improve science practices throughout the rest of EPA. Second, EPA does not use a comprehensive planning process for managing its laboratory's workforce. Many of the regional laboratories provide the same or similar core analytical capabilities, but each region independently determines and attempts to address its individual workforce needs. EPA also lacks basic information on how many scientific and technical employees it has working in its laboratories, where they are located, what functions they perform, or what specialized skills they may have. In addition, the agency does not have a workload analysis for the laboratories to help determine the optimal numbers and distribution of staff throughout the enterprise. We believe that such information is essential for EPA to prepare a comprehensive laboratory workforce plan to achieve the agency's mission with limited resources. Third and finally, EPA does not have complete and accurate data on the real property associated with its laboratories. EPA's 37 labs are housed in 170 buildings and facilities in 30 cities across the nation. Real property management is a government-wide challenge that has been identified by GAO as a high-risk area. In 2010, the administration directed agencies to speed up efforts to identify and eliminate excess properties to help achieve $3 billion in cost savings by 2012. In July 2010, EPA told OMB that it did not anticipate disposing of any of its labs in the near future because the facilities were fully used and considered critical to the agency. However, we found that EPA did not have accurate and reliable information called for by OMB to inform this determination. Specifically, EPA did not have complete or accurate data on the need for the facilities, the property use, facility condition, and the facility's operating efficiency. This concludes my prepared statement. I'd be pleased to answer any questions that you or other members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trimble. And I thank the panel for their testimony, reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will, at this point, open the round of questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. And again, thank you all for being here. Dr. Anastas, I've got some questions with regards to science and some with regards to administration. Let me start with regards to science. I understand that actually the EPA just issued its the outline of how it's going to study the hydrofracturing. I think it was just issued a couple weeks ago. And I understand part of that is that the EPA plans to retrospectively sample its sites. Now, I got to ask you, I mean, when I remembered back to epidemiology, you only sampled retrospectively when prospective data is either, unavailable or too expensive to obtain. But there are thousands of hydrofracturing wells being drilled where you can prospectively obtain data. Why would you choose retrospective data analysis? Again, this goes to the quality of the data that you're going to gather. I'm sorry, your mic's not on.
Thank you for the question. The study is designed to both include retrospective and prospective data. The retrospective data is to look at sites that have had reports of contamination to, one, verify if that contamination has indeed taken place, and two, what the cause of that contamination, if it...
and that's exactly my point, Dr. Nath, and I'm sorry because we've got a few, so I've got to rush you along a little bit, but you could never know how that contamination took place. All you know is the contamination is there then. You don't know if it naturally was occurring at that site, if it occurred before the hydrofracturing occurred. I mean, I got a real problem when we say we're going to do really good science, and then we say, well, and by the way, we're going to look at something retrospectively, we can do prospectively. Now, at those samplings, my understanding is that yesterday the EPA indicated it would not permit industry to shadow EPA when it sampled its sites. Now, you said that integrity, that one way you ensure integrity, or at least encourage the perception of integrity, is through transparency. Why wouldn't you want someone to be there when you sampled at sites? Was that a decision that you all made, or someone else in the your shop made, or someone else?
The study is designed to have very close interaction with the partners who are at the sites.
Doctor, you know exactly what I'm asking you. Can industry representatives be there when you sample these sites? I'm being told that the EPA indicated they would not permit industry to shadow EPA at the sampling on sites. Do you have something to hide with the way you sample? If not, why not let the sunshine in?
Of course not.
So you'll reconsider that decision, you think?
I think that the study is designed so that if the property owner allows for the presence of people beyond EPA on that site, then we have every desire to work collaboratively and as openly as possible.
Well, am I glad to hear that. Thank you very much. Now, you said that Lisa Jackson says science is the backbone of EPA. Now, I'm going to read you a couple things that she said, and I'm going to ask you as a scientist if you agree. She said, we're actually at the point in many areas of the country where on a hot summer day, the best advice we can give you is don't go outside, don't breathe the air, it might kill you. You think that's the way a scientist would word the findings? You comfortable with that as a scientist?
I believe the administrator was talking about the air quality concerns that she had, and that when we are not doing what is needed to be done to improve the air quality, that it's unacceptable, that the advice is to simply stay inside.
Don't breathe the air, it might kill you. Okay. Now, she also said in September that if we could reduce particulate matter to healthy levels, it would have the same impact as finding a cure for cancer. Now, Dr. Anastas, there were 600,000 people in this country died from cancer. Are you going to say that scientifically, you're going to tell us that if we just reduce particulate matter to healthy levels, we're going to save 600,000 lives a year?
I believe what the administrator was saying was that the dramatic health benefits to reducing particulate matter statistically have the type of dramatic increase that you would have on increasing the battle against cancer.
600,000 deaths a year. Dr. Anastas is a scientist. 2 standard deviations out from your estimate. Does it include 600,000 deaths being avoided?
I do not have the numbers.
Could you get me the numbers? Because that leads to my last point, and I only have about 30 seconds, I guess. I've asked for that exact information from someone who testified in front of this committee 2 months ago that said that the cross-state regulations avoid, quote, up to 34,000 premature deaths. Now, Dr. Ness, you're a scientist. That's not the way you word a result. That's the way you word a discussion, something else, opinion. The scientific answer is, it is this estimate, this is the range of the estimate, and this is how I derived it. That's a pretty simple question I asked 2 months ago. Where's the holdup at the EPA? Is it your office or is it some other place? To get that very simple answer. What does 34,000 come from? What does up to 34,000 mean? What are the standard deviations associated with that estimate? Is a summary of individual estimates that, because you and I both know how you can get up to 34,000. You can take 0 to 1,000 34 times and actually have a chance of it being 0. And yet I could say that it's up to 34,000. And as a scientist, that wouldn't be subject to rigorous examination. So where's the holdup? Do you have any idea why I have to wait 2 months for a simple answer?
I'll be happy to follow up with you to get that information to you.
Thank you so very, very much. Because I agree with you that science should be the backbone of EPA, and I agree with you that transparency will contribute to the perception of integrity. But we've got to have both those things. Thank you, Doctor. And I now recognize Mr. Miller for 5 minutes. And welcome.
Thank you, and I apologize for arriving on a dead run and not having been part of the hearing to this point. I did chair the Oversight Subcommittee of this committee, of the Science Committee, for 4 years, and in the 2007 to 2009 period, a turnaround time of 2 months from any agency of the Bush administration would have been a great turnaround time. Dr. Elkins, you conducted a report on the EPA's peer review process, and you determined the EPA's peer review process was, your term was adequate to produce objective scientific review, and you said in your written testimony that there are areas where EPA's peer review process can be improved. Please tell us how the peer review process is adequate and how it could be better than adequate.
Well, our report, for the most part, looked at areas related to potential conflicts of interest in the peer review process and whether or not EPA adequately had procedures in place to not allow conflict of interest to occur. What we found is that the procedures that EPA had in place did not adequately address that issue. But generally speaking, we found that the peer review process was adequate. After our report was issued, EPA agreed with our recommendations, amended its peer review handbook, and as of today, it's adequate.
Okay. And how long ago did they make those changes in their peer review process based on your recommendations?
I don't have that information with me. I believe that report was back in 2009. I can get that for you if you would like.
Okay. I think this hearing is based upon a GAO report that I requested, and I requested to, based on the subcommittee's work, to see if EPA's agency-wide management of its research enterprise and laboratory infrastructure was all that it could be, and we see the results of those criticisms being a much broader criticism of EPA's science, not just whether it was well managed or properly coordinated, but whether it was honest and reliable. Dr. Trimble, in your investigation, did you find any reason to question the quality of EPA's scientific results? Was the science still valid?
The scope of our work did not go into issues of scientific quality. That would not be something that we would venture into, not being a science agency. Our work is really more, are they positioned organizationally to be as strong as they could be?
Okay, so you simply did not look at that. You have no reason, based upon your evaluation, there's nothing in your evaluation that questions the quality of EPA's scientific work?
No, sir.
Dr. Anastas, in light of the various problems that or suggestions that the GAO has made, do you what is the EPA now doing to ensure the quality and credibility of the scientific data and results? Are you changing based on the GAO's study?
In short, the answer is yes. The recommendations from the GAO are welcome. Our response to the GAO enunciates how we are positively responding to those recommendations. Each of those recommendations, those responses are detailed in my written testimony, and in short, we welcome the suggestions and outline how we are proceeding to act on those recommendations.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back 40 seconds.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes our colleague from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the leadership that you were showing on this very significant issue of scientific integrity and the EPA. Those of us who've been around for a while have seeing that there are various methodologies that people utilize to obtain their political agenda. And I would have to say that in my 30 years here in Washington, I have never seen the politicalization of science so dramatically as we have in the last few years. But there's been evidence of that for longer than that, of course. Let me just note that we have the IG here, the EPA's IG here. You have stated, there's a report from your office that the peer review process, which is, of course, one of the mainstays of the scientific process, when applied to greenhouse gas endangerment findings, that the EPA did not meet OMB's actual requirements for a peer review that withstands, that basically meets the standard. Is that correct?
Well, what our report looked at is process, and what our report stated was that we believed that the endangerment finding, the process should have incorporated a highly influential scientific assessment. And there's if you follow that model, there's certain steps that need to occur as opposed to just a influential scientific assessment. Mm-hmm. And so our finding was based that if the HISA was not, that the EPA did not consider or they did not follow the HISA process when they.
So it didn't meet the OMB requirements in this case. So those requirements, that standard wasn't met, and maybe you could tell us what's been done to alleviate that problem. Peer review of greenhouse gas research seems to have been compromised. How have you corrected that?
As Inspector General Elkins noted, there was no, and I believe, as you know, there was no determination that there was any problems at all with the science. What was looked at was the process.
Well, how do you know if the process is faulty? You can't say that the outcome. Oh boy, the IG didn't find the outcome bad. If the process is bad, you don't know what your outcome is.
The EPA made the determination that this was not a high-impact scientific assessment, according to the OMB bulletin.
Is not a what now?
A high-impact scientific assessment, that it was not a high-impact scientific assessment according to the OMB bulletin, and OMB agreed with that determination.
So you did nothing. Thank you.
And if I may add,
so you determined that you didn't have to do anything, even though you have found that even though the IG's office right there has found that you didn't meet the right standard.
And yet, despite following OMB's direction, we have still taken the IG's recommendations and are addressing each of those recommendations, and will be addressing them fully.
Well, we would hope that the next time that we hear your IG reporting that your peer review process doesn't meet the OMB standards, that maybe they'll be able to report that you do next time. But at this point, I'm not sure what your answer reflects, whether or not you've done anything differently. But we'll see what the IG report says next time around. Let me just note that when you determine that there is a problem to be examined, and that you are then the EPA moves forward that now something is going to be regulated because you found a problem with it, it automatically means that there's a lot of things that people are going to have to do now that they otherwise wouldn't have to do. There's a great deal of expense that takes place in our society based on your finding that there is a problem. And even though, and I'd like you to tell me why, and let me see if I'm pronouncing it right, perchlorate, is that how I pronounce it? Perchlorate. Mm-hmm. I've been noticing here, and I've been given by my staff, that the National Academy of Sciences and others have not found any problem with perchlorate, but the EPA has designated it as as something that needs to be regulated by the EPA. Now, why is that? What is the scientific basis that you disagree with the National Academy of Sciences and others who did not find that a problem?
The scientific assessment of perchlorate had findings about the hazard and the degree of hazard of perchlorate. The determination of whether or not to regulate has certainly scientific input and other statutory considerations that need to be considered when making that determination. In whole, all of those factors are considered by the administrator in making that determination.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
We yield back.
sorry.
Thank you.
Yes,
Time's expired.
Pardon me.
I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Anastas, thank you for your testimony and to all of you on the panel. But, Doctor, in your testimony, you mentioned that ORD has organized its research into 6 areas, I believe it is, providing ORD with opportunities to more effectively plan in what is a coordinated way rather than the ongoing individual basis. How do these 6 areas of research align with the research areas of the program and regional offices?
Thank you for the question, because it is that alignment that is the basis of why we undertook this effort. What has been done is to, rather than look at fragmented programs, instead engage our offices of water and air and solid waste in order to determine what the highest priority areas are, and have that discussion directly between the program offices, the regional offices, and our researchers in ORD. It was through that very intensive process over the course of the past year that we identified these cross-cutting areas that will not only give greater synergies and flexibility, but I believe there's a agreement not only internally, but by our Science Advisory Board and our Board of Scientific Counselors, that this will make it more effective in being responsive to those high-priority areas.
Now, when you do that, there might be a concern for duplication or overlap, and just what does the agency do to ensure that there isn't any of that overlap or duplication between ORD's research, for instance, and that of their program offices?
Yes, it is this effort, these conversations between ORD and the program offices that, quite frankly, are happening more now than at any time in the past, that are looking to ensure that we don't have duplication. Those are the conversations that are taking place not only with individual offices but across program offices to ensure either complementarity to make sure that there's not duplication.
Thank you. And Dr. Anastas, you mentioned that ORD takes steps to ensure that there's an involvement by the program and regional offices in ORD's research planning process. You also indicate that ORD provides scientific expertise to the program offices as they develop those regulations and their policy. Now, does ORD have involvement in the research planning process of the program offices?
Yes, it's part of the same discussions that the program offices and the regional offices, as I described, have complementary duties, complementary responsibilities. So the Office of Research obviously has responsibility for research, but other scientific analysis will take place in the program office. Technical support, generation of data for immediate needs will take place in the regional offices, and those are coordinated through these conversations.
And what impediments, if any, are there to ORD and the program offices from being involved in one another's research planning process?
I believe that the efforts that we've undertaken over the course of the past year have removed many of those impediments and have these regular dialogues, these formalized meetings, this regular follow-up is looking to, and I think quite successfully, removing those historical impediments.
Now, you say most of them. Are there any that might exist for which there's a concern or where there's a need for better flow or interaction?
I would be happy to give a thoughtful answer to that, and I'll be happy to follow up if I can think of any additional impediments.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I will take advantage of the 40 seconds that the gentleman had to ask Dr. Anastas. One question that's kind of burning to me, because we'd like to wrap this up before we go to vote. As a scientist, as purely as a scientist, forget with the EPA hydrofracturing study, forget that there's language saying we urge the EPA, which we know that's not statutory binding. As a scientist, you have 5 objectives. You're looking at 5 things in the life cycle in that study. One is whether or not you're withdrawing groundwater and affecting groundwater resource, but then the last 4 have to do with contamination of groundwater. Let's talk about those last 4. The testimony yesterday at Transportation Infrastructure was there have been 1.2 million hydrofracturing wells drilled with no documented case of drinking water contamination. I asked the panel, I keep on asking every panel, has there been documented? No. As a scientist, 1.2 million applications of a technology with no documented effect on those last 4 things that studies look for. Were you part in recommending, did they come to you and say, look, Dr. Anastas, as a scientist, should we really be studying that? Do we really need to study it? Did that question ever occur, or is just the assumption is we're going to do this study, so I'm going to plow ahead and advise how to do it?
There's 2 things that I'd like to say. One is when concerns are raised to this Congress and Congress urges the EPA to undertake a study, we take that seriously. And I think that we all have a bias toward wanting more information out there. The second thing that I think answers your question directly is that you can't find what you're not looking for. And so how we thoughtfully construct a study that Congress urged us to do to ensure that we find out whether or not these concerns are valid and to what degree, I think that that's incumbent upon us when we're urged to do it by this Congress.
The one thing I asked at the very beginning is forgetting the urging to do by Congress. As a scientist, 1.2 million applications of a technology. Is there a justification for expending monies to do that study as a scientist?
I'm really not persnickety about the rules, but we are just, the conduct of this hearing now does not even resemble anything provided for in the House rules. Mr. Tonko did not yield you his 40 seconds.
Let me note for my
Recognize the gentleman from California.
Having been the chairman of various subcommittees, that you are absolutely wrong in your reading of the House rules, because those may have been in the House rules before, but it is the prerogative of the chairman of a subcommittee as to how he will conduct that subcommittee hearing. And I've been in many subcommittees where the chairman went on for 10 minutes in order to get a straight answer from a witness.
Well, thank you. And I'll end because this is the problem. We're blending politics with science. That's the disappointment. I recognize the gentleman from Maryland for 5 minutes.
My question has to do with the same common sense that the chairman is talking about. We have a little community in western Maryland, Georges Creek. Oh, by the way, in Maryland, MDE acts instead of EPA, and that's because they are at least as stringent as EPA, so EPA lets them act. The effluent from the sewage treatment plant at Georges Creek was a little bit out of bounds, and so they had to put in a new treatment plant. That was enormously expensive. It's a very small, very poor community. The state gave them all the grants that legally they could give them, and still there was a huge financial burden on the community. All 3 county commissioners lost their next election over it. Trying to negotiate with MDE over this, that the juice wasn't going to be worth the squeezing, was like trying to talk the fly out of snatching the toad out of snatching the next fly. That wasn't going to happen. They were totally mindless. Georges Creek is hundreds of miles from the bay, and the river enters in where the bay empties into the ocean. There was going to be little or no effect of this. There were many other better places to spend that money than forcing Georges Creek into this. Where does common sense enter in? Clearly that money could have been better spent somewhere else than at Georges Creek, but there was no negotiating with these people. And there are many regulations that you might have that will cause such an economic burden that the money might be better spent somewhere else in our society. How do you make these common sense decisions?
One of the things that I'd like to say about making common sense decisions and decisions about science is that politics cannot, will not, and must not enter into scientific decisions. Politicizing science is antithetical to everything I am and everything that I do. When we engage in scientific studies with the hydraulic fracturing study being discussed today, we've engaged scientific experts from all walks of life, from industry, from academia. We've engaged thousands of people from the public to ensure that this scientific study will be objective. We will not presuppose the results of this scientific study one way or the other.
So I think the chairman's concern is that if there have been 1.2 million frackings and there's zero evidence of any groundwater contamination, any aquifer being contaminated, why would it be common sense to spend any money on a scientific study? Aren't there other places we might better spend our money?
I believe that with an endeavor of the importance of hydraulic fracturing.
But we've done it 1.2 million times and no evidence of any contamination. Isn't there better places we might spend our money than scientific research? I am a scientist. I spent a whole lot of my life doing that, so I understand science.
The level of concern that has been raised by the public needs to be addressed as recognized by this Congress.
But how can the public have a concern when there are zero evidences of contamination after 1.2 fracking operations?
I have to repeat that you can't find something if you don't look, if you don't ask the questions, if you don't do the science. That's why we do science, to answer the questions, to address the concerns. So one way or the other, objectively we can state what the current state of affairs is.
You don't think that there's some validity in observing that 1.2 fracking operations have not produced any evidence of water contamination? You don't think that that's relevant?
I think all data is relevant. All objective, scientifically credible data is relevant. The absence of data is not proof of anything. We construct scientific studies to get data that we can turn into information, that we can turn into knowledge. That's what the scientific endeavor is about.
Let me ask you a question. If you go to the communities where we've had these 1.2 million fracking operations, and you ask them, has there been any water contamination? And they tell you no. So is that not a reasonable scientific investigation?
It's exactly because we have gone out and asked, have there been contaminations? And when people say the answer is yes, part of this study is to validate whether or not that's true, whether or not that has happened.
But it's my understanding that there has been no documented evidence of contamination with 1.2. Who says there's been contamination if that's not documented?
It is the documentation or lack of documentation that we seek. If somebody reports that there has been contamination,
I hope
that needs to be scientifically validated.
I hope that's the most urgent place to spend your money. I doubt that it is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bartlett. Mr. McNerney, gentleman from California, is recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the panel for coming here today. The EPA is a large organization, has a lot of different laboratories. The statutes haven't been changed for a long time. There's no doubt in my mind that there's room for improvement. There's possible duplication, there's possible processes that could be improved, and so on. And I think that's an important function that this subcommittee should be going after. And yet, nothing in this hearing today from the other side has been helpful, and that's stated goal of this hearing, to gain an understanding of the best ways to reorganize and reauthorize the ORD. So, moving forward, Mr. Elkins and Mr. Trimble had a fairly good list of suggestions that they claim have not been implemented by the ORD. So, is it your, Mr. Elkins and Mr. Trimble, is your opinion that this is being resisted, that these changes are being resisted, or is there statutory or resource limitations that are keeping these suggestions from being implemented?
Actually, the reports that we've issued to ORD, for the most part, they have been responsive to our recommendations. We've had a few recommendations, such as the endangerment finding, where we're still waiting a response back from. But generally speaking, they have been responsive.
So the impression I had earlier in your testimony was that they weren't being responsive, but what I'm hearing now is, yes, the recommendations are being listened to, and they're being responded to as the agency has the capability to respond.
Generally speaking, I think that would be an inaccurate.
Thank you. Mr. Trimble?
I think EPA has generally been agreeable to our recommendations, taking a very positive approach to this. One area where I think we have a disagreement is concerning the recommendation about establishing a top science official for EPA to manage all the science activities. As I noted in my opening comments, their proposal to add additional responsibilities to the science advisor, I think, is probably going to be problematic. We will track that. But as I noted, the NRC back in 2000, when they were tracking the same issue, stated in their report that they had underestimated the size of the challenge that would be faced in coordinating science activities across the agency. And they explicitly noted the challenge of dual-hatting the chief of ORD with this responsibility. And much of what they focus on is to corral all the sort of three types of labs, the programs, the regions, and ORD. You need somebody with authority. In a bureaucracy, that means management and budget, in reality, to make things happen and to knock heads and make decisions.
I mean, that sounded like a good recommendation. Do you think there's a statutory limitation that's preventing that from happening, or is there just some resistance within the department? What's your
I know in the NRC's recommendation it requested us that go forward with a second deputy, which I believe would require action by the Hill. We didn't recommend that it go that far, but we recommended that it be a senior person above all the labs. Whether or not EPA could do that on its own, I suspect they could, but that's not something we've delved into.
Okay, thank you. Now, what has suffered from these problems that you all have found? Is it the quality or the quantity? What's been the negative fallout from those deficiencies?
Well, I think it depends on the report. It depends on the area that we looked at. But generally speaking, for instance, on the workload issues and the workforce planning, position management, the issue there is not being able to estimate exactly what your workload is, and therefore not being able to determine what human resources you need to address those issues, or the specialties that you need on staff. That's an issue. The other issue that has come up in other studies have to do with data quality, which relates to the information coming in, whether it's reliable, and whether or not there is systems and procedures in place to make sure that it's reliable. These are the types of concerns and questions that have come up through the reports that we've done.
What I would highlight, specifically to this top science official, I would just quote back to the NRC report that noted that the lack of a top science official is a formula for weak scientific performance and poor scientific credibility. So I think you have this overarching effect. More specifically, you have potentially lost opportunities for collaboration, for consolidating resources, especially with the tight budgets in terms of workforce and workload and facilities. You miss opportunities to leverage that. And then without the data on workload and workforce, you're not in a position to know whether you've got the right people at the right place doing the right thing.
Okay, then again, this may be a statutory issue. It may not. It may be that the EPA doesn't have the authority to create that position on its own. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I will now recognize the chairman of the committee, Mr. Hall from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Anastas, I'd like to raise a few concerns about EPA's study of the relationship between hydraulic fracturing and water. We've had a lot of testimony here, and basically the testimony has been that there's just no way in the world that the testimony you and others from your department have given could be true. And I want to ask you, in response to questions I sent to you, for the record, from hydraulic fracturing hearing in May, you responded on September 23rd that all aspects of this research would have and I quote, this is your quote, an associated quality assurance project plan, unquote, which has been, quote, reviewed and approved prior to the state of data collection, unquote. However, your agency started testing and data collection before the final study plan was done. My question is, were specific project plans completed and subjected to public comment and external peer review prior to testing and prior to the release of the full final study plan? Yes or no?
A quality action project plan is not the study plan or the protocol.
I didn't ask you that. Just give me a yes or no answer to the question I asked you. I don't want a lecture from you.
The quality action project plans are reviewed by experts both internally and externally.
Were they reviewed?
They were reviewed.
Well, that's what I asked you. Were specific project plans completed and subjected to public comment and external peer review prior to testing and prior to the release of the full final study plan?
The review
and your
process.
Answer to that's yes. Is that right?
No. The answer is that they were externally and internally reviewed. The process by which they go through that review is different from that of the full project protocols and plan.
You consider this study a, quote, a highly influential scientific assessment?
That determination has not been made.
Why do you think it hadn't been made?
I can tell you that it has not been made, but and that it certainly will be a decision that we will and a determination that we will make.
Do you think it doesn't meet the threshold?
That determination has not been made.
Mr. Elkins, in your opinion, you think the hydraulic fracturing study should be considered a highly influential scientific assessment?
Sir, we really haven't taken a look at that particular issue, so I'm not in a position to comment.
Okay. E&E News reported that EPA has abandoned its announced study protocol in order to, quote, release more of its findings in 2012, unquote. Can I get any assurance that the committee, or can you give the committee any assurance that this target release date is not politically driven? If so, what's the difference between releasing findings in the late 2012 versus, say, early 2013?
I can give this committee complete assurance that the release of data is not politically driven.
I have one last question. Do I have a little time left?
Yes, you do, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Trimble and Mr. Elkins, your offices have been critical of EPA's process for selecting impartial scientific advisory panels. Can you describe the problems that you've occurred in the agency's handling of external peer review panels, and what can be done to prevent EPA from stacking the panels?
Well, yes, sir. On the one report that we've done that addressed that specifically, again, that I believe we did back in 2009, the specific issue was whether or not the agency had systems in place to identify any conflicts of interest. At that time, we found that the system wasn't robust enough to make those sorts of determinations. But since we brought that to the agency's attention, they have addressed that. And in their current peer review handbook, it does address, our concerns.
All right, I thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I just want to, before we break up, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony, all the members for their questions. To provide a brief clarification for Dr. Morgan's letter for the record, unfortunately, Dr. Morgan was unable to confirm his video attendance at this hearing until 5 hours after the deadline for testimony to be submitted. We're happy to include his comments in letter form as we've accepted, and look forward to working with all members of the scientific community in the future. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. The witnesses are excused. The hearing is adjourned.